This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thank you very much. Thank you for staying the course. It's been a long afternoon. We're moving into the grubby world of journalism, so forgive me if we lower the tone a little. I think for the younger generation at least, the relationship between Mandela and the media really started on that summer sunny afternoon in Cape Town on February the 11th, 1990, when Mandela strode out of prison hand in hand with Winnie, clenched fist in the air, and was seen for the first time in 27 years after being behind bars. And it's easy to forget that his words could not be published in South Africa in that time, and his photograph could not be published either. And for that reason, there was even a little apprehension within the press corps as to whether or not they would instantly recognize him. Well, of course they did. John Battersby, who was here with us earlier, he hasn't come back, has he? No. Was the correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. And he was outside the prison, but he arrived late. He arrived at 3 o'clock, and with little regard for the protocol that said those who get there first get the best positions. He took up a position just by the gate of Victor Verster prison, and as it happened, became the first person to be greeted by Nelson Mandela as he came out of prison. And I want to quote to you what John said when he described that moment. "The moment was caught by most of the television networks and was played over and over again as part of the famous Walk to Freedom. It was a side view of me, but enough for friends around the world to call me. When the networks discovered that the first person to shake Mandela's hand was a fellow hack who'd stolen a march on them, there was predictably a very rapid loss of interest, and I was not interviewed by a soul." Of course, the actual relationship between Mandela and the media started more than 3 decades earlier, as we heard and saw in the film this morning. He was making contact with journalists way back in the 1950s during the treason trial. Anthony Sampson, of course, and then in the early 60s when he was underground and on the run and known as the Black Pimpernel. A television producer by the name of Chris Nicklin has done some research on this, and he says that Mandela understood how to influence the media in a way that could suit his needs. He used to tip off trusted journalists and reacted to events, and he was sometimes frustrated if they didn't report things the way that he wanted, but he understood that there were limitations and limits on the mainstream media at that time. So we come to a key moment. It's around May the 31st, 1961. South Africa is on the eve of becoming a republic. The ANC has been observing a stay at home, and Mandela does an interview with Brian Woodlake of ITN, arranged apparently by Ruth First. Woodlake had arrived in South Africa hoping to interview Hendrik Verwoerd. The interview didn't happen. He was contacted by Ruth First, who said, would he like to meet Mandela? He said he would. And the interview took place in a suburban house near Zoo Lake in Johannesburg, a house belonging to a Wits academic called Professor Julius Lewin. And it took place in the early hours of the morning. It was a house with a service alley at the back, so there was an escape route if they needed one. And the interview lasted about 20 minutes, so we're told, but only about 3 minutes survived and was actually broadcast. And Mandela didn't make a great impression, and the interview didn't make much of a splash back home when it was broadcast. But he had an important message to convey, and that was, of course, that the days of the armed struggle were fast approaching and the days of peaceful protest were coming to an end. Mandela's biographer, Anthony Sampson, says that the atmosphere was tense and Mandela's television debut was not inspiring. But over the next few days, around the end of May in 1961, with the help of Ruth First, who was the go-between, Mandela kept on popping up from hiding and did a series of interviews. He met Stanley Ace and he met correspondents from The Observer and the Financial Times. Again, he didn't make a big impression, but the message was put across. So we come to Mandela's prison years, because the following year he was already behind bars, 1962, and very quickly, certainly after the Rivonia trial of 63-64, Mandela's image and those of his comrades began to fade rather quickly. Anthony Sampson records that in 1964, the year the Rivonia trial ended, there were 58 references to Nelson Mandela in the Times in London. In 1965, the following year, there were 2 references, and in 1966, none at all. So in South Africa, at least, they were forgotten men, and that remained the case until after the Soweto uprising of 1976 and into the protest years of the 1980s. Anthony Sampson says that the prisoners craved news from outside, and newspapers were the most precious contraband. But by the 1980s, when they'd been moved to Pollsmoor prison, they were also listening to the SABC, the South African Broadcasting Corporation, which had a fairly heavy diet of government propaganda, but it did carry reports by the BBC. It was allowed to lift reports by the BBC as well. And Mandela was a keen listener with attention to detail. This is his desk diary from April 1987. There's a reference to a birthday for his daughter Mackie. There's a reference to his blood pressure and his weight. But if you see the date of the 22nd, it reads, Jim Fish of the BBC announces the resignation of Joe Slovo as MK Chief of Staff. So there's nothing vague or anonymous about this dispatch from Zambia. I mean, Mandela has been careful to credit both the BBC and its Lusaka correspondent. So let's come back to the release in February 1990. And as we've seen, that first address from the City Hall in Cape Town was a fairly chaotic moment, certainly rather overwhelming for Mandela. And it wasn't until the next day, after spending the night at Bishop's Court, that he began to catch his breath and launched into his first ever news conference. It's easy to forget that, his first ever news conference. And he offered fulsome thanks to the press. He said, "It was the press that never forgot us, and we are therefore indebted to you." A former colleague of mine, James Robbins, was the BBC correspondent at the time, and he was one of the first to interview Mandela, and he says, Mandela was the star and he knew it. He was utterly in control during the interview, forceful and self-contained, and he points out, of course, Mandela had had many months to prepare himself for the moment. South Africa, of course, was a fairly easy story of good and bad for foreign correspondents, and Mandela started with a huge advantage. He was a towering figure, as we know, and the press responded accordingly. A fortnight later, he moved on to Zambia. It was his first trip abroad. Richard was there as well, and he was working his magic, oozing charm, and once again singling out journalists that he knew and trusted. So this is the scene in the gardens of State House with Kenneth Kaunda on the right, Ali Hassan Mwinyi of Tanzania on the left. The first thing Mandela does, gets up, leans across the table, and shakes hands with Patrick Lawrence, a veteran South African journalist who was crouched down on the other side of the table just out of the shot. So how are we to interpret this? Was it Mandela's respect for the press? Or, as some might suggest, was it a consistent and cynical use of the media to keep them on side? Well, either way, I think journalists often felt disarmed by Mandela when he used this approach and flattered by all the attention. So to 1994 and the historic elections. Mandela, of course, now is very media conscious. He's helped by the fact that his main opponents are F.W. de Klerk and Chief Buthelezi from the National Party and IFP, who between them can only manage a combined vote that is half that of the ANC's. And by the time we get to the inauguration on May the 10th of that year, Mandela is the beneficiary of so much international goodwill that he's virtually beyond reproach, and journalists make the point that he was often hard to criticize. Deborah Patter, a South African journalist, says that Mandela became a master media strategist and there was no objectivity. And this is a very revealing comment. She says, "I was told by my editors, you need to be a bit more critical, but it was hard not to be in awe of him." And another journalist, Rick McConlow, says Mandela loved the media and knew how to play them. He liked to talk to the media. He didn't believe in photo opportunities. He wanted to come into the room, talk to journalists, engage with them, and if necessary, compliment them or correct them. Either way, again, it often caught journalists off guard. So we have the image of a president who gets a bit of an easy ride. The honeymoon period, it lasts a lot longer than 100 days. It lasts for the first couple of years. I would say that, having observed this from a distance and sometimes close up, one of the high water marks of the presidency came when he made his state visit to London, to the UK in 1996. But in that first couple of years, Mandela very quickly handed over a lot of his day-to-day responsibilities to Thabo Mbeki, leaving him free to travel the world a bit like a regal head of state. So Mbeki, as we've heard earlier today, was more or less running the country. Mandela dealt with the issue of reconciliation, and the TRC was set up. But by the national conference, the ANC's national conference in Mafeking in 1997, Mbeki was having to deal with the more difficult issue of transformation. Mandela's presidency, of course, was played out in front of the television cameras at all times, including the embarrassment of his divorce from Winnie. But there was a new media friendliness that was totally different to the years of apartheid with Hendrik Verwoerd, Vorster and Botha, who were, of course, authoritarian figures. Deborah Patter makes the point that Mandela was different. He employed good people, she says. He even told the bodyguards to smile when they pushed people aside. It was good PR. But Chris Nicklin, the TV producer from Cape Town, says that Mandela could be touchy if he felt the media were portraying him or his colleagues in government unfairly or inaccurately. And in such cases, Mandela would invariably lash back, accusing the media in general of dragging their feet over transformation. The veiled warning was that media bosses needed to get their own house in order before accusing the ANC of any shortcomings. So Mandela's advantage clearly was that he held the moral high ground. He never found it particularly difficult to deflect censure, and he remained loyal to his old friends and supporters. Abroad, it was Castro, Gaddafi, and Arafat, and at home, ANC comrades who were allowed to retain positions in cabinet when they were well past their sell-by date. The same, of course, would be true of the Mbeki era. Thabo Mbeki never sacked anybody except Jacob Zuma, but he, of course, came in for much closer scrutiny than Mandela. So I would say that the criticism of Mandela was affectionate rather than stinging. He was more like a grandfather figure, and that was the way people saw him. He was, of course, it's also been recorded that he was also a very strong advocate of press freedom, and he once said, "A critical, independent, and investigative press is the lifeblood of democracy." He said, "I don't want a mouthpiece of the ANC or government. The press would be totally useless then. I want a mirror through which we can see ourselves." So he remained acutely media aware. And his longtime personal assistant, Zelda Lachransi, tells the story in her new memoir, Good Morning, Mr. Mandela, of how when she was traveling abroad, Mandela would always insist on press cuttings being sent from home. So his staff back in Pretoria would be working shifts, cutting out the newspaper cuttings, faxing them, and he wanted them as cuttings sent to him wherever he was and whatever time of day it was. Zelda also says that Mandela was fond of journalists. He used to charm them and court them didn't attempt to change their minds. He just liked to engage with them. So we have an image, a near perfect image, but one that ran into some difficulty during the presidency because HIV infection rates were climbing and AIDS was not a priority. And all this came to a head in 1996 with the scandal over Sarafina, when European Union funds were used by the government on a play that was meant to promote AIDS awareness. And it was criticised by the opposition and by the press significantly for being ineffective and expensive. And Mandela later acknowledged the shortcomings of his AIDS policy. There were too many other things going on at that time, and AIDS was not a priority. In an interview with David Dimbleby of the BBC in 2003, after his retirement, Mandela said he'd been warned not to talk about AIDS when he was president. He might lose the elections in 1999. We know, of course, that in retirement, he confronted the AIDS issue head-on and faced the press with braveness and openness, not least when his son Makatu died in 2005. And in the meantime, of course, his campaign to fight HIV/AIDS, the 46664 campaign, was a key part of all his fundraising efforts. This is Mandela at a concert in 2007. And so we come to the next phase of his retirement, when at the age of 85, he put out an appeal saying, "Don't call me, I'll call you." But of course the calls kept on coming. And Zelda Lachransi, his gatekeeper, was working harder than ever to manage his time. The media interest remained strong. Mandela had risen above ANC party politics. But by all accounts, he was insistent that his face, his name, and his image should never be commercialized. Zelda Lachransi said, "We never sold his time. People wanted to pay to meet him, and we declined." So when I arrived in Johannesburg in 2005 to take over as BBC correspondent for Southern Africa, Mandela was already cutting back his appearances, both public and private. But in that first year, we saw him do a range of things. He launched a comic book series about his life. He met Alex Ferguson and the team from Manchester United. He met Kofi Annan, who'd come to deliver the Nelson Mandela lecture that year. And he met the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas on the steps of his home in Houghton. He also went a little further afield to Johannesburg International Airport when it was renamed after Oliver Tambo. But for the most part, Mandela was staying close to home, and the events that were arranged by the Nelson Mandela Foundation took place at the offices in Houghton. Now, for journalists, these were must-be-there events. Nobody wanted to miss one of these events because they were becoming few and far between. And to be honest, news agencies and picture agencies always wanted to make sure that they had the latest pictures and the latest recordings of Mandela on their library shelves, given his advanced age. Zelda Lachransi, of course, was exercising more and more control, and when there was something for him to say, she was making sure that he stuck to the script and that there were no off-the-cuff remarks. I remember an occasion when the Manchester United team came, and Mandela had brought along one of his great-grandchildren, a boy of about 9 or 10, and a friend. And Mandela said, "I just want to tell you a story." And everybody pricked up their ears at the thought that they were going to get something interesting and juicy instead of a bland statement. And Zelda immediately intervened and said, "Not today." And he said, "Well, she's the boss, so I can't say anything." So that was often rather frustrating for the journalists, that he was not always allowed to speak freely in those later years. So Mandela was many things, of course. We know that he was a lawyer, an activist, a prisoner, a president, an elder statesman, a fundraiser, and an icon. So how do we as journalists remember Mandela? Well, charm and flattery and honesty, but also I think someone who knew exactly how to get his own way, and we've heard frequent references to that nature of his character today. In 2003, he said, "In all my years in public life, my favourite ladies and gentlemen were members of the media. You were always the ones with the most courage to remind and reprimand me when I was acting less than a gentleman." So once again, that's basically the Mandela charm coming out. The last time I had a close encounter with him was on election day in 2009. The press there have staked out their positions hours before the event. This is Mandela coming to cast his vote. It's a golf club at Killarney, just down the road from the Mandela Foundation. So the press have arrived early and staked out their positions, as they did on that day in February 1990. And Mandela is led in, he casts his vote, and is very quickly taken out again, escorted back to the car, but always smiling and always the centre of attention from the public, the media, and even the police. 3 years ago, when his health was failing, Pippa Green in the Mail and Guardian sought to capture his qualities, and she wrote, "I miss his charm, intelligence, and poetic way with words. I miss the insight he had into the media and the genteel yet sharp way he dealt with reporters." Genteel yet sharp seems to, in many ways, sum up the relationship. So no surprise then that last December, the media in their tributes struggled, I think a bit like everyone else, to say goodbye to Mandela. The mood, I thought, was one of obvious sadness, yet it was celebratory rather than mournful. And of course, he was the man who made South Africa a better place. Thank you.